He was a maestro of volume, a giant who taught the world the heaviness of rock and roll. His name was Felix Pappalardi, but when the police entered his fifth-floor Manhattan apartment, there was no music. There was only his body on the floor. A single bullet had pierced his neck. Neat. Cold. Felix's tragedy was not his death. It was his killer. Standing over his body was Gail Collins, his wife, his collaborator, his album artist and lyricist. Together they had built a musical empire. And in a moment of madness, drugged and jealous, they had destroyed it. This is the story of a man who lived to the roar of thousands, but died in utter solitude beside the one he loved. The story does not begin in a dive bar in London or a juke joint in the Mississippi Delta. It begins in the Bronx, New York, in the final days of the Great Depression. The Bronx of that era was a world unto itself, a borough of immigrants, a vibrant tapestry of accents, cooking smells, and striving working-class families. It was in this setting, on December 30th, 1939, that Felix A. Pappalardi Jr. was born. Carrying the ancient heritage of Gravina in Puglia, southern Italy, he entered the heart of the Italian-American experience, a life defined by a powerful trinity: family loyalty, tradition, and unyielding hard work. But in the Pappalardi household, there was a third pillar, one that was treated with a reverence usually reserved for the church: music. And not just any music. We aren't talking about the swing tunes on the radio or the doo-wop starting to bubble up on the street corners. We are talking about the high art of the European tradition. Felix was not an ordinary child. You know the type, the kind of kid who seems to understand the language of music before they fully understand the language of men. While other boys were playing stickball in the streets, scraping their knees and chasing the ice cream truck, Felix was indoors, his fingers pressed against the fingerboard of a viola. The viola is an interesting choice for a boy who would grow up to be a king of heavy rock. It is not the flashy violin singing the high romantic melodies. It is not the cello providing the deep grounding bass. The viola sits in the middle. It is the melancholy voice, the texture, the instrument that fills the gaps and binds the orchestra together. It requires an ear for harmony, for the inner workings of a chord. It is the instrument of the architect, not the diva. Felix's talent was undeniable, and his parents, recognizing they had a prodigy on their hands, ensured he had the best education New York City could offer. He was accepted into the High School of Music and Art. In New York lore, the High School of Music and Art was not just a school. It was a sanctuary. It was the castle on the hill in West Harlem, a place where the most talented kids from all 5 boroughs converged. To walk those halls in the 1950s was to walk among the future elite of American culture. It was a place of fierce competition and rigorous discipline. You didn't just play music there, you dissected it. You learned the mathematics of Bach, the emotional architecture of Beethoven, and the complex dissonance of Stravinsky. Felix thrived here. He wasn't just a player, he was a scholar. He absorbed music theory into his bones. He learned how to conduct, how to arrange, how to look at a piece of music and see it not as a series of notes, but as a structure, a building made of sound. This training wired his brain differently than the future rock stars he would one day produce. When Eric Clapton or Leslie West heard a blues riff, they felt it in their guts. When Felix Pappalardi heard it, he felt it, but he also saw the diagram, the notation, and the potential for harmonic expansion. After graduating from music and art, Felix took his talents to the University of Michigan. This was the logical next step for a young man destined for the symphony. The trajectory was clear. He would graduate, perhaps join a major metropolitan orchestra, maybe become a conductor, and live a life of respectable, quiet, artistic achievement. He would wear tails, he would bow to polite applause, and he would live in a world of order. But history has a way of intervening. The world Felix entered as a college student in the late 1950s was not the same world he graduated into in the early 1960s. The tectonic plates of American culture were shifting violently. By the time Felix returned to New York City after his studies, the orderly world of the 1950s was cracking apart. The city was vibrating with a new energy. The center of gravity had shifted from the uptown conservatories to the smoky, narrow streets of Greenwich Village. The Village in the early 1960s was a mythical place. It was the epicenter of the American folk music revival. It was a place of poetry, radical politics, and acoustic guitars. It was Bob Dylan arriving with a guitar and a dream. It was Joan Baez singing like an angel. It was foggy coffee houses like the Gaslight Cafe and the Bitter End, where baskets were passed around for spare change and audiences sat in reverent silence, snapping their fingers instead of clapping so as not to disturb the neighbors. Felix Pappalardi, the viola-playing conductor from the University of Michigan, walked right into this bohemian explosion. On paper, he didn't fit. The folk scene was suspicious of training. They valued authenticity, raw emotion, and the dust of the road. They liked their singers to sound like they had just hopped off a freight train, not like they had just finished a recital at Carnegie Hall. Felix was an intellectual, a trained musician who could read a score as easily as a newspaper. But this is where Felix's genius first revealed itself. He didn't try to be a folk singer. He didn't put on a fake Dust Bowl accent. Instead, he realized that this raw, beautiful, energetic music lacked something he had in abundance: structure. He began working in the scene not just as a musician, but as an arranger and a producer, though people weren't using that word as much yet. He became the secret weapon of the Village. The scene played out repeatedly. A young folk singer would enter with a beautiful but flat song, but it's just 3 chords and a melody. It's flat. Felix would sit down, listen with those trained ears, and say, "What if we added a cello line here? What if we used a harpsichord instead of a guitar? What if the bass didn't just follow the root note, but played a counter melody?" He worked with artists who are now legends of the genre. He collaborated with the Mugwumps, a band that is famous mostly for who its members became. Cass Elliot and Denny Doherty went on to form the Mamas and the Papas, and John Sebastian formed the Lovin' Spoonful. Felix was right there in the incubator of the 1960s counterculture, shaping the sound before it conquered the world. He worked extensively with Fred Neil, a man with a voice like a cavern, deep and resonant. If you listen to Fred Neil's records from this era, you can hear Felix's fingerprints. The arrangements are subtle but sophisticated. They elevate the simple folk songs into something cinematic. This was Felix's apprenticeship. He was learning how to take the raw, chaotic energy of the street and channel it through the lens of high art. He was learning that you could apply the principles of classical composition to pop music. He was realizing that a 3-minute song could have just as much drama, dynamics, and power as a movement in a symphony. It was during this time that Felix began to transition from the viola to the bass guitar. It was a pragmatic move. Rock and folk bands needed bass players more than they needed violists. But it was also symbolic. He was moving from the middle of the orchestra to the foundation. He was stepping down into the engine room. But as the mid-1960s approached, the folk scene began to mutate. Bob Dylan plugged in an electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival, and the world changed overnight. Folk became folk rock. The acoustic guitars were traded for Rickenbackers and Fenders. The volume began to creep up. The drugs changed from pot and wine to LSD and amphetamines. Felix, with his adaptability and his insatiable musical curiosity, was ready for the shift. He wasn't afraid of the noise. In fact, he saw the potential in it. He saw that electricity allowed for a new kind of sonic architecture. You could build walls of sound. You could create textures that were impossible with acoustic instruments. He began to earn a reputation as a fixer. If you had a band that had great energy but sounded messy in the studio, you called Felix. If you had a song that was good but needed to be great, you called Felix. He was the Don of the studio control room, a nickname that referenced his Italian heritage but also his commanding presence. He was a big man, often bearded with a gentle but firm demeanor. When he spoke in the studio, people listened. And it was this reputation, the reputation of the classically trained genius who spoke the language of the street, that eventually led to a phone call that would change his life and the trajectory of rock music forever. Across the Atlantic Ocean in London, a storm was brewing. A new supergroup was forming, a band that prided itself on virtuosity and volume. They were looking for a producer who could tame their wild improvisations without breaking their spirit. They were looking for someone who could understand them. The band was called Cream, and they were about to drag Felix Pappalardi out of the village coffee houses and onto the biggest stages in the world. By 1967, the world of music was no longer just shifting. It was spinning off its axis. The black and white neatness of the early 60s had dissolved into a technicolor swirl of psychedelia. The Beatles had retired from touring to create the studio masterpiece Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In San Francisco, the summer of love was blooming with the sounds of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. And across the Atlantic, a power trio called Cream was rewriting the rules of how loud, how fast, and how aggressively a rock band could play. It was into this volatile, electrifying atmosphere that Felix Pappalardi stepped, leaving the folk coffee houses of Greenwich Village behind for the high-stakes world of international rock stardom. He had the training, he had the ear, and he had the ambition. But he was about to face a challenge that would test every ounce of his diplomatic skill and musical genius. Felix's true challenge lay not in the music, but hidden deep within the volatile mechanics of Cream. On paper, they were a dream team. Eric Clapton was God, the guitarist who had redefined the instrument with John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Jack Bruce was a bass virtuoso with a voice like an operatic bluesman. Ginger Baker was a jazz drummer trapped in a rock band, a man who played with the ferocity of a wild animal, but in reality, Cream was a nightmare of interpersonal conflict. Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce absolutely despised each other. Their feud was legendary, violent, and deeply personal, dating back to their days in the Graham Bond organization. They would sabotage each other on stage. They would get into fistfights in dressing rooms. Clapton was often left standing in the middle, the quiet pacifist trying to just play the blues, while a war raged around him. Ahmet Ertegun, the legendary head of Atlantic Records, and Robert Stigwood, the band's manager, knew they had a gold mine on their hands, but they also knew the mine was unstable. They needed a producer who could do more than just set up microphones. They needed a referee. They needed a musical peer who commanded enough respect to tell Jack Bruce his bass was too busy, or tell Ginger Baker to rein in a fill. They found their man in Felix Pappalardi. When Felix arrived in New York in May 1967 to work on the album that would become Disraeli Gears, the skepticism from the band was palpable. Who was this American? This classically trained viola player? What did he know about the British blues? But Felix won them over the only way that mattered, with music. He didn't try to outcool them. He out-thought them. He sat down at the piano and spoke their language. He showed them that he understood harmony on a level that even they, with all their virtuosity, hadn't fully explored. The sessions for Disraeli Gears were a masterclass in production. The album was recorded at Atlantic Studios in New York in just a few days. Felix realized that the band's live energy was their greatest asset, but their songwriting needed focus. He became the filter. Take the song, Strange Brew. The track had started life as a completely different song, a more upbeat boogie called Lottie Mama. It wasn't working. It felt generic. Felix, acting as the producer-architect, stripped it down. He suggested they slow the groove, creating a deep, pocket-heavy rhythm that allowed Clapton's guitar to breathe. But the song needed lyrics. It needed a hook. This is where the other crucial character in our tragedy steps fully into the spotlight. Gail Collins was not your typical rock and roll girlfriend. She was a force, a talented visual artist with a sharp, biting wit and a psychedelic imagination. She was Felix's partner in every sense. By 1967, they were a power couple in the New York underground. When Cream needed lyrics for this new, slower groove Felix had engineered, he turned to Gail. She came back with Strange Brew. The lyrics were mysterious, druggy, and perfectly in sync with the times. She's a witch of trouble in electric blue. In her own mad mind, she's in love with you. Now what you gonna do? Strange brew. Kill what's inside of you. It was a perfect marriage of sound and image. The song became a hit, and it cemented the Pappalardi-Collins team as essential to the Cream machine. Gail would go on to contribute lyrics to World of Pain on the same album and co-write several other tracks with Felix in the band. But Felix's contribution went far deeper than just facilitating songwriting. He became effectively the fourth member of Cream. On their next album, the sprawling double LP Wheels of Fire, 1968, Felix's fingerprints were everywhere. Listen to White Room, that iconic apocalyptic opening with the 5/4 time signature, that sense of impending doom, that's Felix. And listen closely to the texture of the song. Those aren't just guitars and drums. Felix is playing the viola on the track, weaving a dark classical thread through the rock tapestry. He played bells, he played organ, he played trumpet. He used his classical training to turn a blues rock trio into a psychedelic orchestra. He also managed the impossible. He kept the band from killing each other long enough to record a masterpiece. He acted as the buffer zone. When Jack Bruce had an idea that Ginger Baker hated, Felix would be the translator, reshaping the idea until Baker accepted it. He was the diplomat in a war zone. However, even Felix's diplomatic skills had limits. By late 1968, the hatred between Bruce and Baker had become toxic. The band decided to split. They played a farewell concert at the Royal Albert Hall and released a final album appropriately titled Goodbye. For Felix, the end of Cream was bittersweet. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of the production world. He had produced platinum records, he had worked with God, and he had helped define the sound of the era. He was wealthy, respected, and famous within the industry. But standing on the sidelines, watching Clapton and Bruce bask in the adoration of the crowd, something in Felix shifted. The hunger that had driven him from the viola to the bass guitar was gnawing at him again. He was tired of being the man behind the curtain. He wanted to be the wizard. He wanted his own band. He wanted to feel the electricity of the stage, not just the sterile air of the control room. He just needed a guitarist who could match his vision. He needed a giant. If Eric Clapton was the sleek, elegant race car of rock guitarists, Leslie West was a bulldozer. Born Leslie Weinstein, he was a big man, literally and metaphorically. Hailing from Queens, New York, he was a force of nature. He played in a local blue-eyed soul and garage rock band called the Vagrants. They were a great live act, sweating and stomping through the clubs of Long Island, but they hadn't broken through nationally. Felix first encountered West while producing a single for the Vagrants. He saw something in the big man that others missed. Most people saw a novelty act, a heavyset guy who could shred. Felix saw a tone. Leslie West didn't play fast. He didn't run scales like a classical violinist. He played the blues, but he played it with a tone that was so thick, so distorted, and so heavy that it felt like a physical weight. It was a brown sound, earthy and massive. Felix, with his producer's ear, realized that if you took that guitar tone and paired it with a bass that didn't just support it but fought with it, you could create something heavier than Cream. You could create a sound that could move mountains. In 1969, Felix produced Leslie West's solo album, simply titled Mountain. It was a solo album in name, but in practice it was the birth of a partnership. Felix played bass on the record, produced it, and co-wrote songs. The chemistry was undeniable. Leslie's raw gutter blues instincts were the perfect foil for Felix's melodic, disciplined arrangements. It was the deity and the superego, the beast and the brain, locked in a groove. When the album was finished, the decision was inevitable. This wasn't a one-off project. This was a band. They kept the name Mountain, recruited a drummer named N.D. Smart, soon to be replaced by the legendary Corky Laing, and a keyboardist named Steve Knight. Steve Knight's role is often overlooked, yet it was vital. Felix, ever the architect, hired a keyboardist not to play solos but to fill out the sound. He didn't want a keyboard player who would compete with Leslie's guitar. He wanted texture. In fact, Steve Knight famously admitted he often couldn't even hear himself on stage because Leslie and Felix were so loud. And they were loud. My God, were they loud. Most bands hone their craft in garages, then play bars for years, then maybe small clubs, then theaters. Mountain took a shortcut. In August 1969, barely formed as a cohesive unit, having played only 3 real gigs in their lives, Mountain found themselves booked for a music and arts festival in upstate New York. The festival was taking place on a farm in Bethel. It was called Woodstock. Imagine the scene. Saturday, August 16th. The sun is beginning to set over a sea of humanity. Nearly 500,000 people, a sprawling, muddy, chaotic city of hippies, freaks, and music lovers. The air smells of marijuana, mud, and unwashed bodies. Felix Pappalardi, the viola prodigy from the Bronx, walked onto that stage with his Gibson EB1 bass, a violin-shaped bass that looked tiny against his frame. Beside him was Leslie West, a mountain of a man with a Les Paul Jr. They plugged in, they turned up, and they leveled the place. Mountain set at Woodstock is the stuff of legend. They were heavy in a way that the Grateful Dead or Jefferson Airplane were not. When they launched into Southbound Train or Blood of the Sun, the ground shook. For Felix, this was the validation of his entire journey. He wasn't just the producer anymore. He was a rock star. He was commanding an ocean of people. There is a specific feeling of power that comes from standing in front of a Marshall stack wall, hitting a low E note, and watching 400,000 people vibrate in unison. It is a drug more potent than anything you can inject or snort, and Felix was hooked. Riding the wave of Woodstock, Mountain entered the studio to record their official debut as a band, Climbing, released in 1970. This album contains the song that would define Felix Pappalardi's career and secure his financial future. It started, as many great rock songs do, with a mistake. During a session, Corky Laing, the drummer who had replaced N.D. Smart, was just messing around. He was playing a cowbell, keeping time while the band was setting up. He shouted out, "Mississippi Queen, do you know what I mean?" Just ad-libbing. Leslie West heard it. He liked the rhythm. He started playing a riff. a chunky, stuttering three-chord riff that sounded like an engine trying to turn over on a cold morning. Felix heard it, and the producer in him took over. He recognized the hook. He and Corky and Leslie worked on the structure. They didn't overthink it. They kept it simple. They kept that cowbell intro, which remains one of the most recognizable drum intros in rock history. The result was Mississippi Queen. It is hard to overstate the impact of this song. In 1970, it was everywhere. It was the anthem of the heavy rock movement. It bridged the gap between the blues rock of the 60s and the metal of the 70s. It was dangerous, it was sexy, and it was impossibly heavy. And listen to the bass. While Leslie is churning out that riff, Felix is playing a melodic driving line underneath that propels the song forward. He's singing harmony vocals, his tenor voice blending with Leslie's growl to create a unique vocal texture. With the success of Climbing and Mississippi Queen, Felix Pappalardi had it all. He was the leader of one of the biggest bands in America. He was a millionaire. He was respected by the critics and adored by the fans. By 1970 and 1971, Felix and Gail Collins were living like royalty. They had a sprawling apartment in Manhattan. They had a house on Nantucket. They were the it couple of the New York rock scene. Gail was integral to the Mountain brand. She designed the album cover for Climbing, a beautiful painted image that evoked a sense of rugged, mystical Americana. She wrote lyrics for many of the songs, including the haunting Nantucket Sleigh Ride, which would become the title track of their next album. Their relationship was viewed by outsiders as a partnership of equals. Gail wasn't just a groupie or a wife. She was credited on the albums. She traveled with the band. She had a say in the visuals, the words, the aesthetic. Felix adored her. He called her his old lady, using the parlance of the time, but he treated her with a reverence that bordered on worship. They projected an image of bohemian perfection. They were rich, talented, and sexually liberated. They espoused the ideals of the open marriage, a concept that was gaining traction in the post-hippie era. The idea was that love shouldn't be possessive. You could love one person deeply but still have physical relationships with others. It was a noble, high-minded theory. But theories, no matter how beautiful, have to survive contact with reality, and the reality of the rock and roll lifestyle in the early 1970s was becoming increasingly dark. The innocent experimentation of the 60s was giving way to the hard addictions of the 70s. Cocaine was becoming the fuel of the industry. It was everywhere. It was in the recording studios, in the dressing rooms, and on the coffee tables of the Pappalardi apartment. Cocaine is a drug of ego. It inflates confidence, but it also breeds paranoia. It makes people talk faster and listen less. It turns minor disagreements into grand conspiracies. For a man like Felix, who was already a control freak in the studio, a trait necessary for a great producer, the drug amplified his need for dominance. For a woman like Gail, who was brilliant but increasingly volatile, the drug sharpened her edges into knives. Even as Mountain was selling out theaters and arenas, the cracks were starting to show. But the sheer volume of the lifestyle began to take its toll. The fun of the early days was replaced by the grind of the machine, and the machine demanded to be fed. The record label wanted a new album every year. The management wanted a tour every season. Felix, who had always been the one in control, started to feel like he was losing his grip on the monster he had created. By the mid-70s, Felix no longer sounded like the exuberant producer of the Cream years. His interviews carried a sharper edge, the fatigue of a man who felt the industry slipping away from him. But the most dangerous erosion was happening at home. The open marriage, which had seemed so liberated in the glow of the 60s, was curdling into a toxic stew of jealousy and power games. Gail was becoming more possessive, even as she exercised her own freedom. Felix was beginning to look outside the marriage not just for sex, but for emotional comfort, something he wasn't getting from Gail, who was becoming increasingly erratic. They started carrying guns. It started as a hobby, a cool rock star affectation, target shooting, collecting antique firearms. But in an apartment fueled by cocaine and resentment, a gun is not a collector's item. It is a prop in a play that hasn't been written yet. As 1971 turned into 1972, Mountain was beginning to stumble. The critics were turning on them. The fans were moving on to newer, fresher bands, and Felix Pappalardi, the architect of Thunder, was standing on the summit of the mountain he had built, looking down. He didn't know it yet, but the descent was going to be far faster and far more violent than the climb. The Don was about to lose control of his family, but the higher Felix built his mountain, the thinner the air became. From the glorious summit, his life began a slow, grinding descent. It is a story of erosion, of his hearing, his relationships, and his sanity. It is the story of how a paradise built on free love and heavy rock turned into a prison of jealousy and paranoia. The psychological unraveling of Felix began with a brutal physical tragedy unfolding silently inside his head. We often romanticize the volume of 1970s rock concerts. We talk about walls of sound and ears bleeding as metaphors for power and intensity. But for Felix, this physical tragedy, the tinnitus and nerve deafness, wasn't just a medical issue. It was an existential crisis. As the high frequencies disappeared, the clarity and crispness of the world began to fade, replaced by a muddy, muffled roar. Imagine the terror. A painter going blind can still remember colors, but a producer who cannot hear the air in a recording, who cannot distinguish the shimmer of a cymbal from the hiss of a tape machine, is losing his connection to his art. This disability changed him. The gentle, diplomatic diplomat who had refereed the fights between Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce vanished. In his place emerged a man who was irritable, defensive, and increasingly controlling. If he couldn't hear the music perfectly, he would force the world to bend to his will in other ways. He began to conduct his life with the same rigid, dictatorial authority he used on the conductor's podium. In interviews from this period, the change is palpable. The joy is replaced by a weary cynicism. He spoke of the music industry not as a creative playground, but as a battlefield. "It's a business," he would say, his voice lacking the warmth of the Greenwich Village days. "And it's a business that kills you." The band Mountain, the vehicle of his greatest performing success, was mirroring this internal decay. Following the massive success of Climbing and Nantucket Sleigh Ride, 1971, the band was trapped on a treadmill of touring that was physically destroying them. They were flying from city to city, hauling tons of equipment, playing the same songs to the same screaming crowds. The creative spark was being suffocated by the demands of the market. The internal dynamic of the band had shifted. Leslie West, the guitarist Felix had discovered and groomed, was no longer the junior partner. He was a guitar god in his own right, widely adored by fans and critics. He was growing tired of Felix's dominance. Felix ran Mountain like an army unit. He made the set lists. He dictated the arrangements. He controlled the money. In a telling interview from 1971, Felix laid his cards on the table with brutal honesty. "If it isn't done my way, there will be no more Mountain." This wasn't the statement of a bandmate. It was the decree of a dictator. And in rock and roll, dictatorships rarely end well. The breaking point came in 1972. The band dissolved. The official reasons given were exhaustion and Felix's hearing issues, which were making live performance increasingly difficult. But the underlying truth was a power struggle. Leslie West and drummer Corky Lane wanted to keep rocking. Felix needed to stop. The betrayal that followed cut Felix to the bone. Leslie West and Corky Lane didn't just retire, they formed a new supergroup called West, Bruce, and Lane. They replaced Felix with Jack Bruce, the very bassist Felix had produced in Cream. It was a stinging professional slap in the face. The two men Felix had mentored, West and Lane, were now teaming up with the man Felix had produced, Bruce, essentially cutting Felix out of the equation entirely. Felix was left alone in New York, a king without a kingdom. He retreated into the studio, but the phone wasn't ringing as often as it used to. The sound of rock was changing. The heavy blues-based rock he had pioneered was giving way to the sleeker sounds of progressive rock and the raw, angry energy of proto-punk. He tried to keep Mountain alive through various reunions in 1973 and 1974, playing tours in Japan and the U.S., but the magic was gone. The reunions felt like what they were, cash grabs by men who didn't particularly like each other anymore. The live performances were often sloppy, marred by drug use and indifference. The Titan was stumbling. As his public empire crumbled, Felix retreated to his private sanctuary, the apartment on East 30th Street and Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. This apartment is a central character in the tragedy. It was a sprawling fifth-floor space that Felix and Gail had turned into a fortress of counterculture luxury. It was filled with expensive art, Persian rugs, state-of-the-art stereo equipment, and the constant haze of expensive marijuana smoke. But by the mid-1970s, the atmosphere inside the apartment had shifted from bohemian paradise to claustrophobic bunker. Felix and Gail's marriage was the stuff of legend in the New York scene. They were the ultimate open couple. In the early days, this arrangement was part of their mystique. But the open marriage is a delicate structure. It requires immense trust, total honesty, and a complete absence of insecurity. And by the late 70s, insecurity was the one commodity that was in surplus in the Pappalardi household. As Felix's career slowed down, his world shrank. He spent more time at home. Gail, meanwhile, was asserting more control. She was no longer just the lyricist and the cover artist. She was managing aspects of his life. She was the gatekeeper. The dynamic began to twist. The openness of their marriage began to feel less like freedom and more like a weapon. They would parade their lovers in front of each other, using them as pawns in a complex psychological game of one-upmanship. It was a Cold War fought with intimacy. And then there were the drugs. If marijuana was the drug of the 60s, a drug of expansion, giggling, and bonding, cocaine was the drug of the 70s. And cocaine is a drug of isolation. By 1975, cocaine had taken hold of the New York music industry, and it had its claws deep in the Pappalardi household. Cocaine does terrible things to a relationship. It inflates the ego while simultaneously creating deep, gnawing paranoia. It makes you feel like a god, but it makes you suspect that everyone else is a devil. Under the influence of heavy drug use, the arguments between Felix and Gail became legendary. They were screaming matches that shook the walls. They were battles of intellect. Remember, these were two brilliant, articulate people. They knew exactly how to hurt each other with words. They knew each other's deepest insecurities. Felix was insecure about his fading relevance, his weight, his hearing. Gail was insecure about her aging, her role as merely the wife of the star, and the constant stream of younger women Felix attracted. The drugs stripped away the empathy that holds a marriage together. In its place, they built a wall of resentment. And into this volatile, drug-fueled pressure cooker, They introduced the most dangerous element of all. Their shared hobby of collecting firearms had turned from an affectation into an obsession. But amidst the rifles and target pistols, there was one gun in particular that would become significant. Sometime in the late 70s, Felix gave Gail a gift. It was a Derringer, a .38 caliber double-barreled pistol. The Derringer is a strange weapon. It is not a hunting rifle. It is not a target pistol. It is a belly gun. It is designed for one thing, to be hidden in a pocket or a purse and used at point-blank range. It is a gambler's gun, a prostitute's gun, a desperate person's gun. Felix gave it to her as a present. Perhaps he thought it was a beautiful object. It had a pearl handle. Perhaps he wanted her to feel safe when she was out alone in the city. But in hindsight, it was like handing a match to a woman standing in a room full of gasoline. Corky Lang, the drummer who had watched the couple's dynamic for years, later recounted the creeping dread he felt when he saw the guns. "When you have guns and drugs around and jealousy," he said, "you're going to have a disaster." It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. While his personal life was arming itself for war, Felix's professional life was suffering an identity crisis. The late 1970s were a brutal time for the dinosaurs of rock. The sheer speed of cultural change was dizzying. In 1976, punk rock exploded out of CBGB's, a club just a short cab ride from Felix's apartment. Bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols were tearing down everything Felix stood for. They hated the long solos. They hated the virtuosity. They hated the expensive studios. And then came disco. The clubs were playing thumping electronic beats. The bass lines were synthesized. The role of the rock god was becoming obsolete. Felix, to his credit, tried to adapt. He wasn't a dinosaur who refused to look at the meteor. He actually tried to work with the new generation. In a fascinating and bizarre collision of worlds, Felix was hired to produce the debut album for the American punk band, the Dead Boys. The album, Young, Loud, and Snotty, 1977, is a classic of the punk genre. But the sessions were a disaster of culture clash. Here was Felix Pappalardi, the meticulous, classically trained conductor who demanded perfection, trying to wrangle a group of nihilistic street punks who barely knew how to tune their instruments and didn't care. The Dead Boys hated Felix's production style. They wanted it raw. He wanted it polished. They made fun of his clothes, his beard, his hippie attitude. It was a humiliation for Felix. He was used to being the Don, the man everyone looked up to. Now he was being mocked by kids who were barely out of diapers when he was playing Woodstock. He also attempted a solo career. In 1979, he released an album titled Don't Worry, Ma. The title itself feels like a plea, a regression to childhood comfort. The album was a mix of funk, rock, and soul. It was competently made. Felix was incapable of making a bad-sounding record, but it lacked fire. It felt like a man trying on different costumes, looking for one that fit. The album flopped. It didn't chart. The phone stopped ringing almost entirely. By 1980, the open marriage of Felix and Gail had effectively closed, but not in the way one would hope. It had become a trap. Felix had fallen in love. This wasn't just another fling, another open marriage encounter. He had met a young woman named Valerie Marians. She was 27 years old, beautiful, and an aspiring singer. Valerie represented everything Gail was not. She was young. She was not jaded by decades of industry battles. She looked at Felix not as a failing provider or a deaf husband, but as a legend. She gave him the one thing he was starving for: adoration and hope. With Valerie, Felix could imagine a different life, a life away from the dark, drug-hazed apartment on East 30th Street, A life without the screaming fights, the paranoia, the pressure. He began to talk about producing her record. He began to spend more and more time with her. For Gail, this was the ultimate threat. The deal of their marriage was that they could have lovers, but they always came home to each other. They were the power couple. They were the team. If Felix left her for Valerie, Gail would lose everything. She would lose her status. She would lose her income. She would lose her identity as the queen of the mountain. The jealousy that had been simmering for years began to boil over. Friends noticed a change in Gail. She became sharper, more aggressive. The stories of her behavior during this time are chilling. She would call the studio incessantly. She would make veiled threats. The drugs in her system, a cocktail of prescription painkillers and cocaine, fueled her fixation. She was losing her grip on her husband, and she was not the kind of woman who let go easily. As the spring of 1983 approached, the tension in the apartment was palpable. It was a physical weight in the air. Felix was making plans. He was talking to lawyers. He was talking to friends about leaving. He was trying to find a way to extract himself from the web he and Gail had spun together over 20 years. But breaking up a partnership like theirs is not like breaking up a high school romance. Their lives were intertwined financially, legally, and artistically. Gail's name was on the songs. Her paintings were on the walls. Her lyrics were in his mouth every time he sang. Felix was tired. His body was failing him. He was overweight. His hearing was shot. His heart was heavy. He just wanted peace. He wanted to go to the studio with Valerie and make music again. He wanted to go back to the beginning, to the purity of the song. On the night of April 16th, 1983, Felix returned to the apartment for the last time. He had been with Valerie, finding solace in her adoration, but he came home to the fortress to face the reality of his crumbling marriage. Stepping through the door of that fifth-floor unit at Waterside Plaza was like entering a pressurized chamber. The air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigarettes, the chemical tang of freebase cocaine, and the suffocating weight of 20 years of shared brilliance and resentment. This was not a random crime nor a burglary gone wrong. It was the thermodynamic inevitability of a closed system overheating. As the night of the 16th bled agonizingly into the dawn of Sunday, April 17th, the sun rose over the East River, casting a pale, indifferent light on Manhattan. But inside, there was no morning rebirth. There was only the stale, heavy atmosphere of a tragedy that had finally refused to end. In the weeks prior, he had been spending more and more time away, specifically in the company of Valerie Marians, the 27-year-old singer who represented his potential escape hatch. To Gail Collins, Valerie was not just a rival. She was the embodiment of Felix's betrayal. She was the new model, younger, untainted by the industry, and looking at Felix with eyes full of adoration, rather than the cynical, knowing glare that Gail had developed over 2 decades. The argument that unfolded that night was likely not a shouting match, at least not initially. It was the tired, circular grinding of 2 people who knew exactly how to hurt each other. Felix, exhausted, overweight, and partially deaf, was likely pleading for a way out, for a separation that wouldn't destroy them both. Gail, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of prescription painkillers and cocaine, was standing her ground. She was the queen of the mountain, and she was not going to abdicate her throne. Toxicology reports would later paint a chemical portrait of Gail's state of mind. Her blood contained significant levels of Percodan, a powerful opioid painkiller, and byproducts of cocaine. This combination creates a state of detachment mixed with hyperfocus. It numbs the body, but sharpens the paranoia. It is a state where irrational thoughts begin to feel like absolute, undeniable truths. At some point in the early hours, the conversation shifted, or perhaps it stopped altogether. According to Gale's later testimony, a story that would divide the rock world and baffle the jury, they weren't fighting. They were in the bedroom. It was 6 a.m. Most of the city was asleep. Gale claimed that in the early morning light, clad in her sheer negligee, she decided it was the perfect time to discuss firearm safety. She claimed that Felix, the man she loved, was teaching her how to use the .38 Derringer he had given her. She claimed he was showing her how to hold it, how to aim it. Crucially, a Derringer is not a hair trigger weapon that goes off by accident. It requires a firm, deliberate pull. It is a weapon of intent, not of chance. At approximately 6 a.m., a single sharp crack echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the booming roar of a shotgun or the rapid fire of an automatic. It was a small popping sound. The bullet, a .38 caliber slug, left the barrel of the pearl-handled gun. It traveled a short distance, point-blank range, and struck Felix Pappalardi in the neck, just above the clavicle. The physics of the wound were devastating. The bullet severed the carotid artery. Felix Pappalardi, the man who had orchestrated the sonic assaults of Cream, the man who had stood before 500,000 people at Woodstock and made the ground shake, collapsed onto the floor of his bedroom. He was wearing his underwear. There was no glory in this moment. There was no final, profound last word. There was only the sudden, shocking reality of violence. He did not die instantly, but he died quickly. The severing of a major artery leads to a catastrophic drop in the blood pressure. The brain is starved of oxygen within seconds. The dawn, the architect, the genius, faded into the darkness. What happened next is a study in chaos. Gale Collins did not immediately flee. She called 911. When the paramedics and the NYPD arrived at the Waterside Plaza apartment, they walked into a scene that looked like a set from a dark, surrealist film. The apartment was a museum of rock and roll decadence. There were gold records on the walls. There were expensive instruments. There was the debris of drug use, and there was Gale Collins. She was hysterical. She was screaming. She was reportedly screaming, "I killed him. I killed my baby." To the responding officers, this looked like an open and shut case, a domestic dispute, a dead husband, a wife with a gun, a confession at the scene. They arrested Gale Collins Pappalardi and charged her with second-degree murder. The news broke slowly, rippling through the music industry like a cold shockwave. First the phone calls between managers, then the radio announcements, then the headlines in Rolling Stone and the New York Times. Rock producer slain. Mountain bassist shot. For the musicians who knew them, Leslie West, Corky Laing, Eric Clapton, the news was horrifying, but perhaps not surprising. They had watched the slow-motion car crash of the Pappalardi marriage for years. Corky Laing, upon hearing the news, reportedly felt a grim sense of inevitability. He knew about the guns, he knew about the jealousy, but as the initial shock wore off, the legal machinery began to turn. And what seemed like a simple case began to twist into one of the most controversial trials in music history. The trial began in September 1983 in the Manhattan State Supreme Court. It was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters, fans, and the ghosts of the 1960s. The prosecution's narrative was clear, logical, and damning. They painted a picture of a jealous, vindictive woman who was being discarded for a younger model. Assistant District Attorney James Kindler laid out the timeline. He argued that Gale knew Felix was leaving her. He argued that she knew about Valerie Marianne's. He introduced the other woman to the stand. Valerie Marianne's testimony was heartbreaking. She described a man who was gentle, brilliant, but deeply unhappy. She described a man who was trying to escape a toxic environment. Her presence in the courtroom was a living, breathing motive To the jury, she was the reason Felix was dead. She was the future he never got to have. The prosecution also focused on the gun. They brought in ballistics experts to testify about the nature of the Derringer. They demonstrated that the gun had a heavy trigger pull. It required significant force to fire. It was not something that just went off because someone sneezed. You had to mean it. They also pointed to the trajectory of the bullet. It hit him in the neck. If they were practicing target shooting, as Gale claimed, what was the target? Why was the gun pointed at his throat? Gail Collins's defense team, led by high-profile attorneys, took a massive gamble. They didn't argue insanity. They didn't argue self-defense, claiming he attacked her. They argued accident. Gail took the stand. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. She was a striking figure, intelligent, articulate, but clearly damaged. She told a story that was intricate and, to many, utterly baffling. She claimed that on that morning, Felix had handed her the gun. She claimed he said, "You need to get used to the feel of it." She claimed he was sitting on the bed. She was standing. She said the gun simply discharged while she was holding it. She wept. She spoke of her undying love for Felix. She painted their marriage not as a war zone, but as a deep spiritual partnership that had hit a rough patch, but was still fundamentally sound. She denied that she knew he was leaving her for good. She framed the open marriage as a mutual agreement that she was perfectly comfortable with. Her defense team worked to humanize her. They portrayed her not as the dragon lady of the rock scene, but as a grieving widow who had made a terrible, tragic mistake. They attacked the prosecution's characterization of the marriage. They argued that the drug use, while admitted, didn't make her a murderer. It made her clumsy. They also exploited the lack of eyewitnesses. There were only two people in that room. One was dead, the other was on the stand. There was no one to contradict her specific account of the exact second the gun fired. Outside the courtroom, a different trial was taking place in the court of public opinion, specifically within the rock community. The sentiment among Felix's peers was overwhelmingly against Gale. Stories began to circulate, stories that couldn't be used in court but painted a damning psychological profile. Musicians told stories of Gale's controlling nature. They called her manipulative. The phrase brilliant but evil was whispered in recording studios across New York. People remembered the way she would isolate Felix, the way she would intervene in business deals. They remembered the cold, intense look in her eyes when she felt disrespected. To the rock community, this was not an accident. This was the final desperate act of a woman who preferred to see Felix dead rather than in the arms of another woman. It was a classic "if I can't have him, no one can" scenario. But a jury is not composed of rock stars and roadies. It is composed of ordinary citizens. And the defense team knew how to play to them. They sowed doubt. Could it have been an accident? Could a drug-addled woman simply have mishandled a dangerous weapon? Was there enough reasonable doubt to avoid a murder conviction? The deliberations were tense. The jury wrestled with the definitions of intent. Murder requires malice aforethought. It requires a specific intent to kill. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Gail Collins Pappalardi not guilty of second-degree murder. A gasp went through the courtroom, but before the defense could celebrate, the foreman continued. They found her guilty of the lesser charge, criminally negligent homicide. It was a strange hybrid verdict. It essentially said, "We don't believe you planned to murder him in cold blood, but your behavior was so recklessly dangerous, so incredibly stupid and negligent, that you are responsible for his death." It was a compromise. It acknowledged she held the gun, but it accepted, or at least couldn't disprove, the possibility that in her drugged state, she didn't mean to pull the trigger at that exact moment. The judge sentenced Gail Collins to a maximum of 4 years in prison. To Felix's family, to his friends, and to the fans of Mountain, this felt like a slap in the face. 4 years? For ending the life of a musical genius? For shooting a man in the neck in his own bedroom? The outrage was palpable. Leslie West was furious. In interviews for decades afterward, you could hear the bitterness in his voice. To him, justice had not been served. The legal system had treated the death of a rock star as a sordid domestic mishap rather than a crime of passion. Gail was sent to the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, but her time there was short. She was a model prisoner. She was articulate, educated, and wealthy. She navigated the prison system with the same intelligence she had used to navigate the music industry. She was released on parole in April 1985. She had served barely 2 years for the death of Felix Pappalardi. After her release, Gail Collins did something that fueled the mystery even further. She vanished. She did not return to the spotlight. She did not write a tell-all book. She did not give interviews to Rolling Stone to clear her name. She essentially erased herself. Rumors swirled. Some said she'd moved to Europe. Others said she was living under an assumed name in California. The truth, as it eventually emerged, was that she moved to Mexico. She lived out the rest of her life in obscurity, far away from the neon lights of New York and the roaring amplifiers of the rock world. She became a ghost. For Gail Collins, the story ended in a cloud of mystery. After serving a surprisingly short sentence, she was paroled in April 1985. She did not seek redemption or publicity. She simply vanished. She retreated to a village in Mexico, living as a recluse until her death from cancer in 2013. She died as she had lived the last decades of her life, essentially alone, carrying the secrets of that April morning to her grave. She never publicly recanted her story, and she never admitted to murder. Back in New York, the music world moved on. That is the cold tragedy of the industry. It is a machine that does not stop for the dead. Yet the silence Felix left behind was deafening. The recording studios felt the loss immediately. The Pappalardi sound, that thick, rich, perfectly arranged heaviness, became a relic of a bygone era. As the 1980s ushered in the age of gated reverb synthesizers and hair metal, the organic blues-based thunder that Felix had mastered was no longer in vogue. The survivors were left to navigate a landscape that felt suddenly and permanently empty. But the most poignant casualty was Leslie West. Without Felix, Leslie was a giant adrift. They had been the perfect dichotomy, the street brawler guitarist and the classical architect. Without Felix's structural genius to rein him in, Mountain became a nostalgia act. For the rest of his life until his own death in 2020, Leslie carried the burden of the survivor. Every time he played the opening notes of Nantucket's Sleigh Ride, it was a eulogy. However, the true legacy of Felix Pappalardi is not found in the sadness of his friends, but in the strange, invincible nature of his sound. Felix created a sonic DNA that mutated and survived in ways he never could have predicted. In the 1990s, as the polished pop of the 80s faded, a new generation of musicians began to dig into the past. They were looking for something heavy, something slow, something that felt like the earth moving. They found Mountain. The entire genre of stoner rock and doom metal, bands like Cuse, Sleep, and Queens of the Stone Age, is built on the foundation Felix laid. They took his concept of the fuzz bass, the idea that the rhythm section should be a wall of distortion, and turned it into a religion. Felix Pappalardi is the unsung godfather of modern heavy metal. But the most shocking twist in his legacy lies in a genre Felix barely knew existed: hip-hop. During a live performance at Woodstock, captured on tape, the band broke down into a funky, drum-heavy groove on the song Long Red. Felix and Leslie shouted to the crowd, clapping their hands. That specific drum break and vocal sample became the holy grail for hip-hop producers. It has been sampled by everyone from Jay-Z and Kanye West to A Tribe Called Quest and A.A.P. Rocky. Think of the beautiful irony. A classically trained viola player who worshipped Bach and Beethoven ended up providing the heartbeat for the golden age of hip-hop. Every time you hear that clap-clap boom-bap beat on a rap classic, you are hearing Felix Pappalardi's Ghost. He achieved a form of immortality that transcends genre, race, and time. When the gunshot fades and the arguments settle into silence, what remains in the giant shadow of Felix Pappalardi? It is a cautionary tale, certainly. It is a grim reminder of the hubris of the Woodstock generation, the belief that you could live without rules, that you could use drugs and open marriages to engineer a utopia, only to find that human nature is fragile and jealousy is fatal. Felix tried to orchestrate his life like a symphony, but he forgot that life is improvised, messy, and dangerous. But ultimately, we must remember him as the architect. He was the man who built bridges. He built a bridge between the conservatory and the gutter. He built a bridge between the blues of the past and the metal of the future. He built a bridge between the silence and the noise. On a quiet Sunday in 1983, the architect fell. The violence of his death threatened to overshadow the brilliance of his life. But music is stronger than violence. Go back to the records. Listen to the thunder of Mississippi Queen. Listen to the psychedelic swirl of White Room. Listen to the delicate, haunting melody of Theme for an Imaginary Western. That is not the sound of a victim. That is not the sound of a tragedy. That is the sound of a mountain. And mountains do not fall. Thank you for watching.